Nonprofit governance.
Nonprofit answers.
Nonprofit board.
Nonprofit management.
Nonprofit marketing.
Nonprofit resources.
Welcome to Nonprofit Everything, the podcast where hosts Andy Shurick and Stacey Wedding answer your questions about all things nonprofit.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Nonprofit Everything. This is Stacey Wedding, and I'm excited to have a special guest expert today to tackle what is a question that I know in my work I have heard a lot of organizations struggle with. I mean, goodness gracious, I am not a nonprofit, but my little teeny tiny business struggles with the same question. So if that hasn't hooked you with some suspense, I don't know what will. I want to welcome, and I'm going to share her bio in a minute, but welcome our guest expert, Lisa Nelsen from Coruzzi Communications. Lisa, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Stacey. I'm really excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. So a little bit of background for those who don't know Lisa. Lisa Nelsen is a local guru in all things branding and communications for nonprofits. After transitioning from a successful career in the corporate advertising, nonprofit, and public education sectors, Lisa dedicated her skills to the broader Nevada nonprofit community. Now, she is the owner of Coruzzi Communications, which offers consulting as well as written and visual messaging services to nonprofits and their mission-driven partners. A second-generation Las Vegas native and UNLV graduate, UNLV grad, fellow UNLV. Lisa is personally committed to community service. Aside from her professional endeavors, she has volunteered with dozens of local nonprofits and children's hospitals and has served 9 years as a court-appointed special advocate for children in foster care. Her dedication also extends to her position on various boards and committees. In 2023, she delivered a TEDx talk about the powerful role of communications in advancing or perpetuating our most persistent societal issues. Wow, quite a bio. You are in for a treat, everybody. Wow. And Lisa, I'm so jealous you got a TEDx. You know that's one of the things I want to do someday in my life.
Yes, and we all want to hear from you on the TEDx stage.
I know. Now I just got to figure out how to make that happen. So anyways, all right. So let's just jump right into the question. So here it is. As a small nonprofit with just a few staff, we wear all of the hats, including marketing when we can squeeze it in. Do you have recommendations for what types of marketing we should do given our limited capacity? It feels overwhelming thinking about all of the marketing vehicles, not to mention appealing to different age groups that like getting information in certain ways, and so on. Help! All right, Lisa, that's a big one to tackle. What are your thoughts?
I'll start by saying it feels overwhelmed thinking about all of the marketing vehicles because that is overwhelming. There's so many that I think for small nonprofits with limited capacity in this situation especially, I think this is less a process of adding volume or adding more and more a process of reduction, right? Like how do we get more strategic, more targeted, and more cohesive in our messaging, and less so, how do I be everywhere all the time for everybody?
I'm curious to know, I love that idea of let's simplify and reduce instead of add. I'm sure that's music to people's ears. And so what, when you're guiding organizations, how do you help them decide what they remove or what they focus on?
Yeah, and a lot of times that conversation starts with exploring the current assumptions about where we, quote, should be. I know a lot of nonprofits, operate under this assumption that, well, we should be on every social media platform because that's what's trending, or that's what everyone else is doing, or that's just what we should be doing. And so I think it's an individual conversation aligned to that organization's goals and more specifically their target audience. So for small startup-y nonprofits who, are sort of local, community focused, I think you should model just that and go exactly where your community is. So who's your audience, where are they actually spending time, and then go exactly where that is. And so for a lot of those types of nonprofits, that'll probably be more, like community partnerships. Are there other organizations that are in front of that audience right now? Are there overlapping efforts going on? So for example, if you're providing some sort of after school program or a tutoring program, where are the schools spending time, and how do you reach those schools and their families and get into those same rooms that are already there? Or sometimes there's overlap in service areas. If you're providing mortgage assistance, for example, or rental assistance, and there's food banks who are serving similar audiences who, might need your services. So I think partnerships are often overlooked when we think about getting our message out there. And I know that's not a traditional first top of mind marketing asset that comes to mind, but it's a really great place to start, especially when you have very limited capacity, staff capacity, and budget.
I love the idea of building on sort of that inner circle of people who are already, that's what I hear you saying, is those who you're already aligned with. So you're not sort of going out there into the universe where no one maybe has heard of you, or you're trying to recruit people, but you've got like-minded or people who are already know the value of the work you're doing. And that's part of it, right? Of what you're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. And the most powerful messaging about your organization and the most likely referrals to your organization are going to actually come from other humans. So you can be doing all the fancy, gimmicky, expensive marketing, but ultimately, those relationships, those people who are interacting, like, hey, I was at this thing and I saw this nonprofit, or I had this really great conversation with this person who represents this nonprofit. Like that experience, face-to-face interactions that's an absolutely like free, already there opportunity to get your message out, because then that has a compounding effect, because those people are going to share it with their network and they're going to think about you. They're going to remember that feeling. They're going to remember that experience with you.
Can you take that idea down and really walk us through, whether it's an example of what you've done for somebody, or, how does this look from a brass tacks perspective? So, okay, I identify our organization has 3 community partners, just by way of example. And what does that look like for actually starting to message and communicate with them? Beyond, you have that face-to-face, which is a component, but then where do you take it from there to build that true relationship? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think where my mind is going actually aligns to part of the question too that I wanted to address, which was, how do we also address, and communicate with different age groups and different audiences who receive communications differently? And I will say, one, like where people are and how they might prefer to receive their communications might vary. But I want to emphasize that people across all audiences share a very similar preference, right? They just want things to be clear and succinct. And so the first step is always going to be around your message, right? Like, what's your core messaging? And that's usually where I like to start with clients. There's really no order of operations here. It could be different based on different situations and different organizations. But the message is key here, because you have different constituents, different team members, board members, donors, volunteers talking about your work. And as much as we can get that message consistent, cohesive, and clear, you're going to cover all of those bases. Because what you don't want to happen is, someone's talking about it over here, and you have a newsletter over here, and your board's at a barbecue over here, and everybody's getting different takeaways about what you do. So messaging is always a very, very strong foundation that you want to build from before we even talk about execution and tactics and all of the vehicles from which you can deliver that message.
I love that. Are there some questions that you would ask someone to think about? Because messaging is tough for folks, right? I find that in the sector, you have a lot of passionate people who know a lot and also use a lot of jargon and all the things that we've all seen, and you kind of get everything but the kitchen sink with when you ask them what do you do, or tell me more about your organization. And I think people struggle with, how do I boil that down to exactly what you're saying, this sort of clear, consistent, cohesive, simple, like that's something that sticks. Like I also say stickiness is important here too. So how does someone go about, if they don't have the expertise of you in the house, how do they go about figuring that out themselves?
I love so much of this. I'm like giddy right now. My jam. I live in the complexity of that question. I think, and I've heard you and Andy mention this on an episode, around, first of all, remembering that you are not your target audience. You might be, but you're unlikely to be your target audience. So one is understanding, when you're in it and you have all this expertise and knowledge, it's really difficult from that position to put yourself in the position of somebody else who doesn't have your knowledge and your experience and your expertise and isn't in your industry. So they don't understand the lingo, the acronym, the jargon, the madness. So yes, to reducing jargon, making it feel accessible, because when I say concise, cohesive, simple, and clear, that's not to be confused with being overly simple or cutting out the inherent complexity and nuance to nonprofit work. It's really just like, this is another example of like how it's actually more of a process of reduction. Like how much of this information in your existing messaging is either redundant, unnecessary, filler words, filler statements, fluff, like, can somebody else repeat the same sentence and it could be interpreted, similarly or a million different ways, versus how do you take this and make it just a little bit more clear, just a little bit more specific, and go through that process of like, and it's usually a process of cutting more so than adding. But simple doesn't have to be at odds with, the actual complexity of the issue that you need to communicate.
Yeah, I hear that. That sounds important. So potentially even looking at, if somebody's in a house and it feels so difficult to do it yourself. Like, and so I don't know if there's a way. I know people can do this, but it's hard. You have to almost remove yourself and come in and pretend like you're a consultant and looking at your statement as a third party that doesn't know anything. And that's hard for people to do. So are there things you recommend or questions someone can ask, or even a strategy of involving someone who maybe is less familiar with the work to sort of get to start priming the pump for reducing that messaging and clarifying it?
Yeah, just look to the humans who are right around you. Like run a statement by your spouse or your mother, or better yet, like a friend who's like really unfamiliar with your work, and say like, how does this resonate? If I said this to you, if you saw this statement somewhere, what would you take away from that? If I read this mission statement to you, what would you take away, or is what our work is about? So, and then use that feedback from just that external perspective. Or there's also opportunities with the actual humans you're speaking to, because there is a lot of differences and preferences with how people understand and receive information. So if you're ever unclear about how your audience is receiving your message, like just ask them. Say like, is there anything that's confusing to you when you see pieces like this? Or is there anywhere, you need additional support? Like, just talk to your people and see what they have to say.
I think that's invaluable. And it actually reminds me of something a friend that I know who is created their own business recently and reached out to me and said, so Stacey, when I'm just asking you this because I'm trying to get my messaging straight and my branding straight, what would you say I do? If you were talking to someone and trying to describe what I do, or like what I'm about, like what my company's about, what would you say? And it was a powerful question because it took me a moment to sort of digest, thinking about all the different pieces that I've heard her talk about, and then cite it back to her. And I think it was, I asked her how it went when she got done, because she said, I asked you and several other trusted sources, and she came back and said what it was really like a wake-up call was everyone's saying different things about who I am, what I do, what services I offer. And I think the same thing probably happens in nonprofits. If you said, hey, like, what do we do, right? Or what would you talk about the kind of work, we do, or our mission or our purpose for existing? What would you say? It'd probably be a really interesting case study.
Yeah, I love that activity because we often, assume that it's clear because it's clear to us, it's clear to our employees, but it's clear to us because we are immersed. Like, we know this, we do this every day. But, you don't know if it's clear to others until you run it past them, or just like take that critical eye at the message and take a look at the language choice and say, is this specific? Is this clear? Like, we use a lot of, I want to be careful about my word choice here, but like, we're purpose driven. So it's easy to use, language that feels heartful and resonant and sweet, but it's not always clear. Like, we see a lot of phrases like, we're changing lives, we're transforming communities, we're building brighter futures. And that's a great example. Like, if you run that past somebody, like if I tell you my organization is here to build brighter futures, that'll run the gamut.
Yeah.
Like, are you talking about students in school? Are you talking about, providing housing for human? Like, it could be literally anything. Like, any service area could arguably be building a brighter future. Building, like, literally, like, are we building houses? Like, there's so many different interpretations. So just replace statements like that with something more specific. We're providing meals for humans in this region. We're pairing children in foster care with mentors. Just replace terminology that could be interpreted a million different ways with something very specific that makes you unique and your value unique.
Yeah, unique is important. I love that. So back to I could probably go on 10 tangents with you with this one question, but back to thinking about, so an organization starts with their messaging and sort of really taking a hard look at it, getting it refined. So now they've got that in place. What would that look like if they have a few community partners or key organizations that they feel like are natural stakeholders to build from? What would you see if you were walking through how that would kind of move forward in messaging to those folks?
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of that, the messaging piece is going to be internal alignment and external delivery, right? So it's going to be a process of getting everybody aligned to that messaging. Ideally, having your key stakeholders play a role in shaping that message in the first place so that they're all aligned before it's even complete. So getting that internal alignment, cohesive, direction is one part of that. And then whether it's, communications with partners or an email campaign or, various social media assets, the final delivery of that messaging should be some sort of guidelines, just like you have your visual brand identity document, like a core messaging document that guides all of those conversations, not in a way that makes you feel scripted, because we do want to be natural, authentic, organic humans out in the world. Like, that's going to make the message resonate. But it's just a matter of like, here's what we avoid. Here's how we don't speak about, especially when we're talking about the humans we serve, we want to make sure we're speaking in a dignified and uplifting manner. So guardrails like that and, phrases to avoid and how to be more specific, elevator pitch ideas, but allowing flexibility for people to make it their own. But ultimately, that messaging alignment is about guardrails and a general direction of how we communicate about this in a way that's like really intentional and aligned.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. Because how many of us have seen that where somebody that we say, hey, here's this document, and they either go off script or they feel like they have to rehearse and recite it and it feels really stilted. And it does more damage than anything. And yeah.
That's where, and I kind of alluded to this too, but to put an actual name on it, the most overlooked component of your brand, right? Your brand is made up of three major buckets. The one is the obvious one, which is your visual brand, your actual identity, your color palette, your typography, your logo. And then there's the written, of course, the messaging that we're talking about. How do we brand ourselves in our spoken, written, and conversational, messaging? And then the third, which is going to tie all of this together, is experiential branding, right? Like, how are we actually bringing those visuals and written to life in the decisions we're making, in our organizational culture, in the sort of tone we set when we're out in the community with partners or serving our constituents, right? Like, we're not, branding professionals like me are not here to just decorate and make it look pretty and embellish your language. Like, it's critical that these things are embodied in your organizational structure and the day-to-day experience, because that's what's really going to make it authentic, and it's what's going to make all of those efforts thrive long term.
I love that, because we've all seen the people that have all the right words and all the right visuals, but we know our experience as maybe someone who interacts with their organization doesn't feel at all like what we see visually or in written form. And there's no bigger, it feels so inauthentic and such a disconnect.
Right. Yeah. So if we go too rigid and too almost corporate-y in our approach to messaging, it's just not going to land. Like, that human element will take you far in actually resonating with other humans. So it goes back to that point too about like how different audiences are at different places, sure, and have different preferences when the details come up, but we're all humans, and humans, we have more in common than we do have differences. So communicate like a human to real humans. And that's the key to success here.
So back to the question about what marketing vehicles. I hear you've put a lot out there, right? It doesn't always start with the vehicle, which is a very tactical piece. It starts with, our own sphere of influence and connections. But I think in today's world, where we know that there's information overload and people are on all the email list or can't even keep up with social. Once these other pieces you're talking about are in place, do you have any advice about the marketing vehicles? And I know you said less is more sometimes, right? Particularly starting out, but thinking a little bit about, okay, I have to make a decision about how do I get people to opt in today's day and age? And so are there strategies you've seen work for that? And then I know the vehicle depends probably on some of these other pieces, but any advice you would give as we kind of bring together all the pieces you're talking about with people once they're like, okay, we got the messaging, we got our key sort of spheres of influence that we can tap into. Now what? Like, do you have an answer to the now what?
Yeah, and a lot of the work comes before that now what question, right? It's because when we're talking about moving people to action, like, they are more likely to do that when they know you, they're familiar with you, they have experienced you, or they're close to somebody who has. And so that word of mouth, that community is huge. I really like to modify the phrase success is where opportunity meets preparation, and switch it up to say success is where community meets preparation, right? Because opportunity just doesn't up and present itself. It comes from other humans and other relationships. And so building that community is necessary before anybody's even going to take those actions. Social media is like a great example. It's vast, it's massive, and I love it when nonprofits master social media. It's so fun to follow them, especially when they're doing their TikTok thing and find creative ways to integrate those trends into like genuine communications about their work. But it's really a supplement to a lot of those other like more face-to-face interactions. Because it's not a place where people are taking a lot of action. And that's a nuanced conversation. Of course, we can talk about targeted ads where it is more localized and things like that. But in any case, in any situation, people are more likely to act when they're familiar with you or they know you in some way or someone close to them does. So you have to do that work.
do you think that does it start with just thinking about you have a face-to-face interaction, or you've got kind of a vendor table at something and someone comes up and you have a conversation with them? Is it very much like at that point saying, hey, we'd love to bring you on to whatever, our email list so you can get updates on what we're doing. And then that's where you start to build like that ongoing relationship, since there's not always time to do the face-to-face, right? There's only so many hours in the day. So is it sort of opportunities like that you see most effective?
Yeah, good point. Yes, it is definitely a ladder of engagement, right? We want to keep that momentum up when somebody has that good experience with you, and have that moment of connection of like, man, I really like these people. We don't want to lose that. So we definitely do want to continuously engage, whether it's through some sort of onboarding process in your email marketing systems, or, and this is where social media as a supplement, it's a good example of that. Like, maybe they had that experience with you and then they're scrolling and then they see you and they recognize you and they follow you and now they're sharing your stuff. Like, we do want to do these things. I don't mean to, put them in the back burner or diminish the importance of them, but that's exactly a good example of what I mean by like they're a supplement to those more personal opportunities to connect and resonate. The other thing I want to address too is like the less is more type comment. Like, I'm about that as a writer. Like, I like to reduce and simplify, but at the same time, sometimes more is more. And I don't want this tension that we feel a lot nowadays about attention spans are dwindling. Like, I need to simplify. We don't want that to stop us from sharing the whole of our message, right? So the other key here is leveraging those platforms as opportunities to go into various levels of depth with people. So maybe in a face-to-face conversation at a tabling event, you can be more conversational and custom in what you're sharing with people. But then, on social media, it's more optimal to just do like a graphic or something that'll quickly get attention. But then it's also important to say, okay, where do we dig in? Where can we send people to dig in more? And so does your website have robust messaging? Is there an annual report or something that tells the full story and the full complexity of your work? So having different levels of detail on different platforms where it makes more sense, and then guiding people through that information.
Yeah, it sounds like such a journey, thinking about it like a customer journey lens of, right, it starts here and where do we take them, and sort of mapping that out. And I wonder if there's also, I know a lot of different opinions about how much should just be, hey, here's an information or something to help engage you, versus a call to action. Do you have any rules of thumb for those who are like, hey, we want people to donate, we want volunteers, right? We want these things. Do you have any rules of thumb or guidelines for organizations to make sure they're not doing too much of that, but also making sure they still do that from time to time? Because otherwise people go, how do I engage?
Yeah, exactly. Great question. And there's a lot to unpack under that. And so I'm processing out loud. But the first thing I would say is you definitely want balance, and you definitely want to consider how your messaging is going to make the human on the receiving end feel. So when we do a lot of call to actions and asks and flood people with, urgency, right? Like donate now, or like this is urgent, and they're getting that in a million different places too. And as much as, yes, you need that, and you need to make that ask, and you need that engagement, is it more likely that it'll be a yes if you bring in value and information and experiences before you make that ask, or supplement it with other things that ease the nervous system? Because we don't want people to start to associate our organization with stress and urgency and madness. Like, we want to say, we don't want to over communicate that there's a problem. Like, a lot of nonprofits are serving issues that have been around for generations. Like, people know that there's a problem. So when we focus too heavily on the problem, what we do is we forget to convey that we have part of the solution. And so we want to be truthful about the urgency and the issues, but at the same time be cognizant of, I think what's even more prevalent than attention spans decreasing is the stress that's increasing. Like,
Yes.
so much noise, so many issues, so many like world's problems that at this point everybody's like, I just need to self-preserve. Like, I just need to go like in a quiet, dark room and get away from the world. Like, that's kind of the mind space that your audience is likely in. And so when we come out with them with, well, now pay attention to this issue and this is getting worse, and what are we going to do about this? Like, as much as we can sort of integrate a little bit of hope and optimism and togetherness and community, and that's another example of where we don't want to do messaging for the sake of it, or like core values for the sake of it. Like, we need to model those things and infuse them into our community through the work we're doing.
Every time you and I have ever had a conversation, I am always reminded of how there is complexity to doing this, that people can absolutely do it. It's not out of reach. And it's not just as simple as which social vehicle am I going to use? Yeah. I'm just reminded of it. And I'm thinking about that for those which is why having expertise for those who are listening, right? Finding that expertise, even having, if you have anyone on your board that's got some of this expertise that you can lean into as well to help think through some of these things. Because this isn't necessarily what you're taught when you go to run a nonprofit, right? This isn't something everyone knows, but there's a lot of different nuances. And yet I also think there's great comfort in knowing it doesn't have to be that you're doing all of it and keeping up with all the trends. What do they say? Build your own sort of tribe or circle of folks, right? And just keep expanding that. And that's where the ripples happen. And it also doesn't happen super quickly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And especially when an organization is in a situation where they're approaching it from that mindset of like, where can I think the listener used the term squeeze in. How do I squeeze in marketing? It's like, quite frankly, like it's too much of a undertaking to squeeze in. So that's why a lot of my remarks are actually really focused on, like, not only is it effective not to focus so much on tactics and vehicles so much as getting those fundamentals secure first, but it's also a matter of like, what can you actually sustain at this point? Like, if you have a little bit of time today and so you establish, your social media platforms on every single one, how are you going to maintain that? So yeah. When you're in that situation, like, it's just, okay, what can you actually focus on that you can sustain at this time? Because we don't want to just keep like throwing spaghetti at the wall, or like you have this social media channel and people are going to it, but there's nothing published on there. Like, that's when people start to get a perception that like, oh, maybe the lights aren't on, maybe they're inactive, maybe they're understaffed. I'll just go somewhere else, So you want to be careful to adapt strategies that you can commit to, because that tells a story too. Messaging isn't just what you're out there. Sometimes it's what's not out there.
That's powerful. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's sort of not only what is spoken, but what's unspoken or not being said. And that says a lot.
Yeah, people are shaping perspectives of you and perceptions of you in and outside of your curated content, right? Like, and especially, like, I'm always going to emphasize the experiential branding, because we can have the most rock solid messaging and everybody's super aligned to it and communicating in the most cohesive yet authentic way possible, and your visuals are on point. Like, nothing will diminish all of that work faster than somebody having a negative experience with a staff member who gave them attitude at an event, or like seeing a boss yelling at an employee, or a volunteer saying, oh, that was such a bad experience, I'm not going to volunteer with them again. Like, all of this is not going to matter if you don't model everything we're saying that you're about in the way that you present yourself publicly.
That is a really powerful way to bring this all together. And I just can't thank you enough, Lisa, for sharing your time and your expertise with our listeners. Thank you for being here today with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for letting me nerd out about nonprofit communications. I can do this all day. You got a few more hours?
Well, for those who want to know more about Lisa and her background, we'll of course put her info in the show notes. And we so appreciate our listeners, and we appreciate our guest experts like Lisa, who are willing to share their time and all the knowledge that probably some battle wounds in there too, because that's where we figure it out and figure out what to do and not to do. So thank you, Lisa, and thanks to our listeners for being here. Until next time.